"Pick it up," Ethan Whitmore said, his voice smooth but sharp enough to slice through the low hum of conversation. And the moment the cash left his hand and hit the polished marble floor, the entire restaurant seemed to inhale and forget how to breathe, the bills landing in a shallow spill of water from a tipped glass, edges darkening as they soaked, the overhead lights catching on the surface and reflecting upward like a mirror. And in that reflection was Ava Brooks, standing still, tray balanced in one hand, shoulders squared, not stiff but grounded, like she had decided something long before this moment ever came. A few people at nearby tables exchanged glances. One man leaned back with a smirk. A woman lifted her phone just slightly, pretending to check a message while angling for a better view. And somewhere behind the bar a glass stopped mid-polish, the cloth frozen against it. Because everyone knew this kind of moment, the kind where power tested how far it could go. Ethan didn't raise his voice again, didn't need to, his tailored suit catching the soft gold light, cufflinks glinting as he adjusted his sleeve, eyes barely meeting hers as if she were part of the furniture, something functional, replaceable, and the silence stretched, not empty but heavy, filled with the faint hum of the air conditioning and the distant clink of ice settling in a forgotten drink. Ava glanced down once, just once, at the money, at the way the ink bled slightly into the water, at how something meant to signal value could look so small when it lay there. And then she looked back up, her face calm, not defiant in the loud way people expected, but steady, the kind of calm that didn't ask permission. She didn't move to pick it up, didn't shift her weight, didn't rush to fill the silence. And that was when the room changed, almost imperceptibly, because hesitation was expected, compliance was expected, but stillness like this felt different, like a line had been drawn. Somewhere no one else could see. Ethan's jaw tightened just a fraction, not enough for most to notice, but enough that the man seated beside him cleared his throat softly, unsure whether to laugh or look away, and a whisper traveled from one table to another, low and quick, like a ripple across water. Ava's fingers adjusted slightly on the edge of the tray, the metal cool against her skin, grounding her, and for a moment the scent of citrus cleaner and warm bread drifted through the air, ordinary things pressing in against an extraordinary pause. And then, without raising her voice, without stepping closer, she spoke, her words measured, clear, and somehow louder than anything that had come before. "Sir, you might want to check the contract you're about to sign." And it wasn't the content alone that shifted the room. It was the certainty, the absence of apology in her tone, the way she said it like a fact already written somewhere no one else had bothered to read. And for the first time since the cash hit the floor, Ethan looked at her directly. Really looked, not as staff, not as background, but as a variable he hadn't accounted for. And the faintest crease formed between his brows as the silence deepened, no longer comfortable, no longer predictable, but waiting, suspended, as if the entire room had just realized it might have misjudged who held the real weight in this moment. The words did not echo, but they lingered, suspended in the space between them like something fragile that could either break or shatter everything around it. And for a brief second no one moved. Not the man holding a glass halfway to his lips, not the couple whispering at the corner table, not even the server near the kitchen door who had forgotten to breathe. Ethan's gaze sharpened, no longer dismissive but measuring, as if recalculating the value of something he had already written off. And the faint crease in his brow deepened just enough to betray the shift, subtle but undeniable, while the man seated to his right let out a small, uncertain laugh that died almost immediately when no one joined him. "You are giving advice now?" Ethan asked, his tone calm, almost amused, but the edge beneath it had changed, less certain, more probing, and Ava did not flinch, did not lower her eyes, her posture steady as the tray rested against her palm, the cool metal grounding her as the room seemed to lean closer without moving, drawn into the quiet gravity of the moment. "I am stating a fact," she replied, her voice even, not loud but precise, each word placed carefully like steps across something unstable. And somewhere behind Ethan, a man in a navy suit shifted in his chair, pulling a leather folder closer, fingers brushing the edge as if the object itself had suddenly become important. Ethan exhaled slowly through his nose, a controlled breath, the kind that usually preceded dismissal, but instead of waving her off, He tilted his head slightly, studying her with a focus that felt new, unfamiliar, like he was seeing something that did not fit the narrative he had already decided. "Then go ahead," he said, a faint smile touching his lips, not warm, not kind, but curious in a way that unsettled the space around him. "Show me." And the words landed heavier than his earlier command. Because this time the room did not expect compliance. It expected failure, a quick unraveling that would restore the balance everyone understood. Ava shifted her weight forward by a fraction, not stepping into his space but not retreating either, and the faint scent of polished wood and citrus hung in the air as she set the tray down on the edge of a nearby table, the soft click of metal against marble sounding louder than it should have, drawing every eye to the small, deliberate movement. She extended her hand, not toward the money on the floor, but toward the folder in front of Ethan, her fingers stopping just short, a silent request rather than a demand, and for a heartbeat he did not move, his gaze flicking from her face to her hand, then back again, as if weighing something that had nothing to do with contracts or numbers. The man beside him leaned closer, whispering something under his breath, but Ethan did not respond, his attention fixed, the room holding itself in that fragile balance between arrogance and doubt. And then, almost imperceptibly, he turned the folder. Slightly, enough for her to see. Not an invitation spoken aloud, but not a refusal either. Ava's eyes dropped to the page, scanning quickly, her focus narrowing, the noise of the room fading into a distant blur as lines of text arranged themselves into meaning, patterns, risks, a structure she recognized not as theory, but as something lived, studied, understood, and her finger hovered over a paragraph, not touching yet, just marking the place where everything shifted. The lawyer across the table noticed first, his posture tightening, eyes narrowing as he leaned in, drawn by the same instinct that had pulled Ava to speak in the first place. And the silence that followed was no longer passive, it was charged, expectant, as if the room itself knew that whatever came next would not return things to the way they had been. Her finger lowered, stopping just above a single paragraph as if even touching it might set something off, and the lawyer across the table leaned closer, his chair letting out a faint scrape against the floor that sounded too loud in the silence, his eyes narrowing as he followed her gaze. And Ava finally spoke again, softer this time, but with a precision that cut deeper than volume. "Section 14, subsection C, third line," she said, each word steady, deliberate. "It shifts all post agreement liability entirely onto your company, not shared, not conditional, entirely." And a ripple moved through the table, subtle but real, like a breeze through still air, while Ethan's fingers tightened slightly on the edge of the folder, his knuckles paling just enough to catch the light. "That is standard phrasing," the man beside him said quickly, his voice carrying a hint of defensiveness that had not been there before. But Ava did not look at him, her focus remaining on the document, her mind already several steps ahead. "It is not standard when paired with the clause above it," she replied, and this time she pointed, lightly, just enough for the lawyer to follow. "Because that clause removes your right to contest any post-agreement claims, which means if anything goes wrong, legal, financial, or otherwise, your company absorbs it entirely, and the other party walks away clean." And the words did not rush. They settled, one by one, into the space around them, heavy, undeniable. The lawyer's posture shifted again, more sharply now, his hand reaching out to turn the page fully, scanning faster, eyes moving left to right, then back again, and the faint confidence in his expression began to fracture, replaced by something tighter, something less certain, while Ethan watched him, not Ava now, but the man he trusted, the man whose job it was to see what others missed. And the silence stretched, no longer passive, no longer curious, but tense, waiting. "That is not possible," the lawyer muttered under his breath, but he did not sound convinced, his finger tracing the lines as if hoping they would rearrange themselves into something safer, something familiar. And across the table another executive leaned in, then another, their movements small but synchronized, drawn by the same gravity, the same creeping realization that something had been overlooked. Ava stepped back half an inch, not retreating, just giving the moment space, her hands now resting lightly at her sides, the tray forgotten behind her, the cash still on the floor where it had fallen, untouched, irrelevant. Ethan's jaw shifted again, slower this time, his gaze flicking back to Ava, studying her with a new intensity, not dismissive now, not even skeptical, but searching, as if trying to understand how she fit into a situation that had just slipped beyond his control. "Explain it clearly," he said, his voice lower, stripped of its earlier ease. And for the first time it sounded less like a command and more like a request, controlled but edged with something else. Something closer to urgency. Ava met his eyes without hesitation, her voice calm, unshaken. "If you sign this as it stands, you take full responsibility for every outcome tied to this agreement, even those you cannot control, and you lose the legal ground to challenge it later." She paused just long enough for the weight of it to settle. "It is not protection. It is a transfer of risk, entirely onto you." And the words hung there, undeniable now, while the lawyer finally leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly, the sound quiet but heavy, his silence speaking louder than any confirmation. And in that moment, the room shifted again, not back to what it had been, but forward into something none of them had expected, because the girl they had been ready to dismiss had just changed the balance of everything without raising her voice even once. No one spoke, but the silence was no longer empty. It pressed in from every direction, thick with realization, and Ethan Whitmore slowly leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking softly beneath him, his eyes still fixed on the document, as if the lines might rearrange themselves if he looked long enough. But they did not. They stayed exactly where Ava had pointed, unchanging, undeniable. And across from him the lawyer cleared his throat once, then again, but no words came, just a slight shake of his head, almost imperceptible, yet louder than any admission. Ethan's fingers tapped once against the table, then stopped, his usual rhythm gone, replaced by stillness. And when he finally looked up at Ava again, the expression in his eyes had shifted, not softened, not yet, but sharpened in a different way, like someone who had just realized the ground beneath them was not as solid as they believed. "How did you see that?" he asked, his voice lower now, stripped of its earlier confidence. And the question did not sound like a challenge. It sounded like something closer to disbelief, as if the answer mattered more than the mistake itself. Ava did not answer immediately, not because she hesitated, but because the moment itself felt fragile, like speaking too quickly might break it. And in the quiet she could hear the faint hum of the ceiling lights, the distant clatter of dishes from the kitchen, ordinary sounds that suddenly felt far away, as if this small space had separated from everything else. "Because it is not hidden," she said finally, her voice calm, steady. "It is just written to be ignored." And a subtle shift moved through the room again, not shock this time, but something deeper, something that carried weight. One of the executives leaned back, running a hand across his mouth, while another stared down at the table as if avoiding eye contact with the truth itself. And the man who had defended the clause earlier now sat silent, his earlier certainty gone, replaced by a tightness in his shoulders that spoke for him. Ethan exhaled slowly, longer this time, his gaze drifting briefly to the cash still lying on the floor, the edges curling slightly as the water spread, and for a moment his jaw tightened, not in anger, but in something closer to recognition, as if that small act from minutes ago now carried a different meaning, one he had not intended but could no longer ignore. He reached for the folder again, flipping back to the page, scanning it himself, slower now, more carefully, his eyes tracing each line with a focus that had not been there before. And the room remained still, waiting, no one daring to interrupt the quiet recalibration happening in real time. Ava stood where she was, not moving forward, not stepping back, her posture unchanged, her presence steady in a way that did not demand attention but held it anyway. And the contrast between her stillness and the shifting energy around her grew sharper with every passing second. "If I had signed this," Ethan said after a moment, more to himself than to anyone else, his voice almost a murmur, "we would have carried every risk alone." And the lawyer gave a small nod, finally finding his voice just enough to confirm. "Yes," he said quietly, the word landing with more weight than it should have needed. Another pause followed, longer this time, stretching out as the full implication settled across the table, across the room. across every silent observer who had witnessed the moment unfold from arrogance to awareness. Ethan closed the folder slowly, the soft thud echoing just enough to mark the shift, and when he looked up again, the distance between him and Ava no longer felt defined by status alone, but by something else entirely, something he had not expected to confront tonight. And the room, still and watching, seemed to understand that whatever came next would not be as simple as it had been before. The air did not relax after the realization. It tightened, settling into a quieter kind of tension that no one could ignore, and Ethan remained still for a moment longer, the closed folder resting beneath his hand like something heavier than paper, his thumb pressing lightly against the edge as if grounding himself in something tangible. And when he finally spoke again, his voice had changed, not louder, not softer, but stripped of the effortless authority it had carried before, replaced by something more deliberate, more aware. "Everyone out," he said, not sharply, not as a command thrown across the room, but as a decision already made, and the effect was immediate. Chairs shifted, glasses were set down. Conversations that had not yet resumed stayed buried, and one by one the executives stood, gathering their things with quiet efficiency, no one questioning, no one lingering longer than necessary, because the tone had shifted in a way that made the next moments feel private, even in a public space. The lawyer hesitated half a second, glancing between Ethan and Ava, as if wanting to say something, to recover some ground, but he stopped himself, gave a small nod, and followed the others out. The soft closing of the door sealing the room into a smaller world. The noise of the restaurant crept back in at the edges, muted, distant, like it belonged somewhere else. And for the first time since the moment began, it was just the two of them standing across from each other, separated by a table, a mistake, and everything that had led to it. Ethan's gaze dropped once more to the floor, to the cash still lying in the thin pool of water, the edges now slightly warped, and the image lingered longer this time, not dismissed, not ignored, but understood differently, and he stood slowly, the movement controlled, measured, as if he were aware that every gesture now carried weight. He walked around the table, not quickly, not hesitantly, each step quiet against the marble, until he reached the edge where the money lay, and he paused there, looking down at it for a moment before bending slightly, not fully, just enough to gather it from the floor, the damp bills sticking faintly together as he lifted them. And for a brief second his reflection appeared again in the thin layer of water. Distorted, unfamiliar. He straightened, the cash now in his hand, and turned back toward Ava, but he did not immediately extend it, did not repeat the earlier gesture. Instead he held it loosely at his side, as if unsure what it represented now. "I was about to sign something that could have cost millions," he said, the words slow, measured, not dramatic, just factual, "and I missed it." A pause followed, small but significant, his eyes lifting to meet hers fully, without distance this time, without dismissal. "You did not." And the silence that followed was different again, no longer tense, no longer uncertain, but reflective, as if the room itself was adjusting to a new understanding of what had just happened. Ava remained where she was, her posture unchanged, her expression calm. But there was something quieter beneath it now, not satisfaction, not pride, just a steady presence that did not seek acknowledgement yet did not avoid it either. And she did not step forward, did not reach for the money, did not interrupt the moment that seemed to be unfolding on its own. Ethan's grip on the bills tightened slightly, then loosened, and instead of offering them back, he placed them gently on the table, away from the water, the motion simple but deliberate, removing the earlier meaning without needing to address it directly. And he exhaled once more, longer this time, as if releasing something he had not realized he was holding. "Tell me your name," he said, and this time it was not a question thrown casually into the air. It was grounded, intentional, carrying a different kind of weight, one that acknowledged what had shifted between them, and for a moment the entire night seemed to narrow down to that single exchange, quiet, steady, and irreversible. Ava did not answer immediately, not because she did not hear him, but because the question itself felt different from everything that had come before it. And for a brief moment the sounds of the restaurant pressed back in, the low murmur of distant conversations, the faint clink of glassware, the soft rhythm of footsteps moving past the closed space around them, as if the world had resumed while something here was still catching up. She let out a quiet breath, steady, controlled, and then met his gaze without hesitation. "Ava," she said simply, her voice calm, grounded, carrying no need to impress or soften the truth, and the name seemed to settle between them, small but significant, like a marker placed at the exact point where everything had shifted. Ethan nodded once, slowly, as if committing it to memory, not out of courtesy but intention, and for a second, he looked like a man recalibrating something deeper than a business decision, his eyes no longer scanning for advantage but searching for understanding, and he stepped back half a pace, creating a space that had not existed before, one that felt less like distance and more like respect. "Ava," he repeated, quieter this time, testing the weight of it, and his gaze drifted briefly toward the folder still resting on the table, then back to her. "You said this would have cost us everything," he added, not as a challenge but as a continuation, something he needed to hear fully, completely. Ava's hands rested lightly at her sides, her posture unchanged, and she gave a small nod. Not dramatic, not exaggerated, just certain. "It would have," she said. And there was no hesitation in her voice, no trace of doubt, only clarity, the kind that came from seeing something others had overlooked. Ethan studied her for a moment longer, his expression shifting again, softer now but still controlled, as if he were deciding how far to go, how much to acknowledge, and then he asked, "Where did you learn to read contracts like that?" And the question lingered, not invasive but direct, carrying a weight that reached beyond curiosity. Ava glanced down, briefly, not in avoidance but in thought, the overhead light catching the edge of her cheek as she considered the simplest way to answer something that was not simple at all, and the scent of polished wood and faint citrus lingered in the air as the moment stretched. "I used to study it," she said finally, her tone even, measured, "before I had to stop," and the words were quiet but complete, offering just enough without opening everything. And Ethan's brow furrowed slightly, not in confusion, but in recognition of what was left unsaid, the kind of understanding that did not need details to feel real. He glanced again at the money resting on the table, now separated from the water, the edges still slightly curled, and then back at her, and something in his posture shifted once more, less rigid, less guarded, as if the moment had stripped away the need for performance. "You are working here," he said, not as a statement of fact, but as something he was trying to reconcile, and Ava gave a small nod. "Yes," she replied, simple, direct, and the contrast between that single word and everything she had just demonstrated hung in the air, undeniable. Ethan exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting past her for a second before returning, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a different weight, quieter but more deliberate. "That does not make sense," he said, not dismissively, but honestly, and the honesty itself shifted the space between them, narrowing the distance that had once felt fixed. Ava did not respond right away, her eyes steady, her presence unchanged, and in the quiet that followed, the imbalance that had defined the beginning of the night no longer felt as certain, as if something had been undone without anyone fully realizing when it happened, and the room, though still the same, no longer held the same hierarchy it had just minutes before. Ava let the silence sit for a moment longer, not out of hesitation, but because rushing an answer would make it smaller than it was, and the faint hum of the overhead lights seemed louder now, filling the space between them as Ethan waited, his posture no longer demanding but attentive, like someone listening for something that mattered. She finally spoke, her voice steady, unforced. It stopped making sense a long time ago, and there was no bitterness in it, just a quiet acknowledgement, the kind that came from experience rather than complaint, and Ethan's gaze did not leave her, his expression tightening slightly, as if the simplicity of her words carried more weight than he expected. Ava shifted her weight just enough to ease the pressure on her feet, the hours of standing catching up in small ways, but her posture remained composed, grounded, and she continued, "I studied business law for 2 years," she said, the words landing softly but clearly, "top of my class." A brief pause followed, not for effect, but because the next part did not need emphasis. Then my mother got sick. And the room seemed to narrow again, not physically, but emotionally, the details painting themselves without needing to be fully explained. Ethan's jaw moved slightly, not in reaction to the facts themselves, but to what they implied, the gap between what she had been and where she stood now. And for a second he glanced down at the table, at the contract, at the money, as if all of it belonged to a different version of reality then, the one he was now facing. "So you left," he said, more a conclusion than a question, and Ava gave a small nod. "There was no one else," she replied, her tone even, not defensive, not apologetic, just factual, and the weight of responsibility sat quietly beneath her words. The faint sound of a door opening somewhere in the restaurant drifted in, followed by a burst of distant laughter that quickly faded, a reminder that the world outside this moment continued as if nothing had shifted, and yet everything here felt different. Ethan exhaled slowly, his gaze returning to her, more focused now, more present. "And now you are here," he said, and it was not judgment, it was recognition, an attempt to reconcile the gap between potential and circumstance, and Ava did not look away. "For now," she answered, the two words simple but layered, carrying both acceptance and something else, something not yet finished. Ethan nodded once, almost to himself, as if that answer confirmed something he had not yet put into words, and he moved back toward the table, his hand resting briefly on the folder before sliding it aside, clearing the space without thinking about it, and the gesture felt symbolic in a way he did not acknowledge out loud. "You saw something my entire team missed," he said, his voice quieter, more deliberate, and there was no arrogance left in it, only a measured respect that had not existed before. And Ava did not respond immediately, not because she disagreed, but because the statement itself did not change what she had done, it only changed how it was seen. "I saw what was there," she said after a moment, her voice calm, steady, and the distinction mattered, subtle but important, because it shifted the focus from ability to awareness. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion but in thought, and the silence that followed was no longer uncomfortable. It felt like something being built, slowly, carefully, piece by piece, and for the first time since the night began, there was no tension pressing against the moment, only a quiet understanding that whatever came next would not return to what it had been before, because something fundamental had already changed. The quiet between them did not feel empty anymore. It felt like a space where something was being weighed, measured without words, and Ethan's gaze lingered on Ava a second longer than before, not searching for flaws now, but trying to understand how someone standing in a server's uniform carried the kind of clarity his entire team had overlooked. And he finally moved again, slow, deliberate, pulling out the chair across from him as if the motion itself required thought. "Sit," he said, but the word did not land like an order. It was quieter, almost uncertain, as if he was testing whether the moment allowed it. And Ava paused, just briefly, her eyes flicking to the chair, then back to him, reading the shift, the absence of hierarchy that had defined everything minutes ago. And after a second she stepped forward, placing her hands lightly on the back of the chair before sitting, her posture straight, composed, not shrinking into the seat, but not claiming it either. Ethan remained standing for a moment, as if adjusting to the new arrangement, then took his own seat, the distance between them now measured not by status but by conversation, and the restaurant noise drifted faintly through the walls, a low murmur that felt distant compared to the stillness at the table. He leaned forward slightly, forearms resting on the polished surface, fingers interlacing, and for the first time his posture resembled someone listening rather than directing. "Why did you speak up?" he asked, his voice calm, steady, but carrying a question that reached deeper than the contract itself. And Ava did not answer immediately, her gaze dropping for a fraction of a second to the table where the folder had been, then lifting again, steady, clear, "Because someone needed to," she said, and the simplicity of it settled heavier than anything more elaborate could have, because there was no strategy in her answer, no attempt to impress, just truth. Ethan studied her, the corners of his expression tightening slightly, not in disagreement but in recognition, and he nodded once, slowly, as if that answer confirmed something he had not yet admitted to himself. "Most people would not," he said, almost quietly, and Ava's lips pressed together faintly. Not quite a smile, not quite a reaction, just acknowledgement. Most people are not asked to choose, she replied, her tone even, between staying quiet and watching something go wrong. And the words hung there, not accusatory, not directed at him alone, but broad enough to include the room that had been full just minutes ago. Ethan leaned back slightly, his chair giving a soft creak, and his gaze drifted past her for a moment before returning, as if he was replaying the earlier scene in his mind. The cash, the silence, the way the room had waited for her to comply, and something in his expression shifted again, quieter, more reflective. "And you chose to speak," he said, and Ava nodded once. "Yes," she answered, and there was no hesitation, no need to justify it further. A brief silence followed, but it was not heavy anymore. It felt settled, like something understood without needing to be explained again, and Ethan's eyes moved to the side, catching a glimpse of the staff moving beyond the doorway, trays balanced, conversations continuing, the rhythm of work unchanged. And when he looked back at Ava, the contrast between her presence and the role she occupied seemed sharper than before. "You should not be here," he said, the words quieter now, not dismissive, not critical, but grounded in a realization that had fully taken shape. And Ava held his gaze, unflinching, her voice calm as she answered, "I am exactly where I need to be." And the response did not reject his statement, it reframed it, shifting the meaning in a way that lingered longer than either of them expected, leaving the space between them filled not with tension, but with the quiet weight of two perspectives that had just begun to meet. The words did not fade after she said them. They settled, quietly reshaping the space between them, and Ethan did not respond right away, his eyes holding hers as if testing the weight of what she meant, not just hearing it, but trying to understand the conviction behind it. And for a moment the low hum of the restaurant seemed to stretch, distant and irrelevant, while something more internal took its place. He leaned back slightly in his chair, the polished wood catching the light as his fingers tapped once, then stilled again, and his gaze drifted briefly to the empty space where his team had been sitting earlier, the absence now louder than their presence had been, a reminder of how quickly certainty could collapse. "You say that like this is enough," he said finally, his voice measured, not dismissive but searching, and Ava did not look away, her expression calm, steady. "For now, it is," she replied, and there was no hesitation in it, no sense of compromise, just a clear boundary that she had already accepted. Ethan studied her again, longer this time, and something in his posture shifted, not dramatically, but enough to show that he was no longer trying to fit her into a role he understood. He was adjusting to something he did not, and the silence that followed was not empty. It felt deliberate, like a pause before a decision. "What happens next?" he asked, not rhetorically, not as a challenge, but as a genuine question, and Ava's gaze lowered for a fraction of a second, not in doubt but in thought, as if she had already considered that path long before this moment had forced it into the open. "You fix what almost went wrong," she said, her voice even. "You make sure it does not happen again." And the answer was simple, practical, grounded in action rather than recognition, and it carried no demand for credit, no expectation of reward. Ethan let out a slow breath, the kind that came from accepting something unavoidable, and he nodded once, almost to himself, before leaning forward again, his hands resting flat against the table, the posture no longer guarded but engaged. And when he spoke again, there was a quiet shift in his tone, something more direct, more intentional. "And you," he said, his eyes steady on hers, "what happens to you?" And the question lingered differently, more personal, more difficult to answer in the same clear, structured way, and Ava held his gaze for a moment before responding, her voice unchanged but carrying a subtle depth that had not been as visible before. "I keep going," she said, and the simplicity of it landed with a quiet force, because it did not rely on this moment to define what came next. It existed independently of it. Ethan's expression tightened slightly, not in disagreement, but in recognition of how limited that answer was compared to what he now understood she was capable of, and his gaze flicked briefly to the side, toward the hallway where staff moved in a steady rhythm, unseen, unheard unless someone chose to notice. And when he looked back at her, There was something different in his eyes, not just awareness, but decision forming. You should not have to, he said, the words low, deliberate, and Ava's brow shifted just slightly, not in confusion but in acknowledgement of what he was implying without fully stating, and the space between them held that implication, unspoken but clear, and for a moment neither of them moved, neither filled the silence, because it felt like something that needed to settle on its own, something that could not be rushed without losing its weight, and the room, quiet and still, seemed to lean into that pause, waiting for what would come next. The words lingered after he said them, not loud, not forceful, but steady in a way that made them impossible to ignore, and Ava did not respond immediately, her gaze holding his as if weighing whether the moment deserved an answer or simply recognition. And for a brief second the rhythm of the restaurant slipped back into focus. A server passing by the doorway, a quiet laugh from a distant table. The ordinary world continuing just beyond the edge of something that no longer felt ordinary. Ethan shifted slightly in his chair, his fingers pressing against the polished surface of the table, then relaxing, as if the decision forming in his mind required something physical to anchor it. And when he spoke again, his tone carried a clarity that had not been there before, not earlier in the evening, not even minutes ago. You should not have to keep going like this, he said, more firmly now, but still controlled, his eyes steady on hers, not looking past her, not looking through her, but meeting her fully, and Ava's expression did not change, not outwardly, but there was a subtle shift beneath it, something quieter, more guarded, as if she recognized where the conversation was moving before he said the next word. I am offering you a position, he continued, the sentence measured, deliberate, each word placed carefully as if he understood the weight it carried, on my team, and the space between them seemed to tighten again, not with tension, but with expectation, as if the room itself had paused to hear the outcome. Ava's fingers moved slightly against the edge of the chair, a small, almost imperceptible motion, grounding her, and she did not react the way others might have. There was no immediate surprise, no visible relief, just a stillness that held something deeper, something more complex than the offer itself. Why? She asked, her voice calm, direct, and the question did not challenge him. It clarified the moment, stripped it down to its intention, and Ethan did not hesitate this time, his answer coming without the need to search for it. Because you saw what mattered, he said, his tone steady, and you spoke when no one else did, and the words settled between them, not as praise, but as acknowledgement, and Ava's gaze held his for a moment longer before shifting briefly to the table, to the place where the contract had been, to the quiet evidence of what had almost happened, and then back again. That does not mean I belong there, she said, her voice even, not dismissing the offer, but not accepting it either, and the honesty in her tone carried more weight than a simple refusal would have. Ethan leaned back slightly, not retreating, but adjusting, as if the response did not surprise him, as if he had expected resistance, and his eyes narrowed just a fraction. Not in frustration, but in thought. It means you already do, he replied, quieter now, more certain, and the room seemed to settle again. The conversation no longer about opportunity alone, but about recognition, about whether something seen could be ignored once it had been understood. Ava did not answer right away, her silence stretching just long enough to carry meaning, and the faint hum of the lights returned to the edges of the moment, filling the space that words did not, and when she finally spoke, her voice remained calm, but there was a subtle shift beneath it, something more personal, more grounded in reality than in possibility. I cannot leave, she said, not abruptly, not defensively, just clearly, and the words did not close the door, but they did not open it either. They simply placed a boundary where the conversation had not accounted for one, and Ethan's gaze held steady, not pulling back, not pushing forward, as the weight of her answer settled between them, reshaping the moment once again into something neither of them had fully anticipated. Her words did not fall away after she said them. They settled into the space between them with a quiet finality, and Ethan did not interrupt, did not push back immediately, his gaze steady on her, as if he understood that what she had just placed, there was not resistance for the sake of it, but something rooted deeper, something he had not yet accounted for. the low murmur of the restaurant drifted in again. A server passing by the doorway with a tray balanced carefully, the faint clink of glass against glass echoing softly. And for a moment the contrast between that steady rhythm and the stillness at their table felt sharper than before. "Because of your mother," Ethan said after a pause, not as a question, but as a realization forming out loud, and Ava gave a small nod, her expression unchanged, her voice calm when she answered. "She needs someone there." And the simplicity of it carried weight, not dramatic, not emphasized, just true. Ethan leaned back slightly, his chair giving a soft creak, his eyes drifting briefly to the side as if recalibrating again, this time not about contracts or risk, but about something less structured, less predictable. And when he looked back at her, there was a shift, subtle but clear, not just understanding, but adjustment. "Then the problem is not the position," he said, his tone quieter now, more deliberate. "It is everything around it." And Ava watched him for a moment, not surprised by the conclusion, but measuring what he would do with it. Because words like that could lead in many directions. The silence stretched again, not heavy, but thoughtful, and Ethan's fingers moved lightly against the table, a small, controlled motion that hinted at the pace of his thinking. And then he spoke again, more directly this time. "Where is she being treated?" he asked, and the question landed differently, not probing for leverage, but seeking context, and Ava hesitated for just a fraction of a second before answering, not because she did not trust the moment, but because the information itself carried weight. "St. Mark's Medical Center," she said, her voice steady, and Ethan nodded once, slowly, as if filing it away with the same precision he had used for numbers and contracts. But this time the intent felt different, less transactional, more human. "And your hours here," he continued, his gaze steady. "How many do you work?" And Ava's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in focus, as if the pattern of his questions was becoming clearer. "2 shifts," she replied, "morning and evening." And the details settled between them, practical, measurable, something that could be adjusted, and Ethan leaned forward again, his posture more engaged now, more certain. "Then you are not leaving anything," he said, the words firm but not forceful, grounded in a decision that had already begun to take shape. "You are adding something." And Ava's expression shifted just slightly, not in acceptance, not in rejection, but in recognition that the conversation had moved beyond a simple offer into something more complex, something that did not fit into the boundaries she had set a moment ago. "I cannot be in 2 places at once," she said, her tone even, but there was a subtle tension beneath it now, not defensive, but real, and Ethan held her gaze without wavering, his voice steady when he responded. "No, but you can choose how your time is used." And the statement did not dismiss her concern, it reframed it, opening a possibility without forcing it. And the space between them shifted again, not closing, not resolving, but widening into something that neither of them could fully define yet. And in that quiet expansion, the moment held, balanced between what had been and what could be, waiting for the next choice to be made. The space between them did not collapse after his words. It stretched, quietly reshaping itself into something neither of them had fully defined yet. And Ava remained still for a moment, her gaze steady on him, not dismissing what he said, but not stepping into it either, as if she understood that possibility alone was not enough to change reality. The faint hum of the lights above cast a soft glow across the table, catching the edge of the water glass, the slight ripple inside reflecting movement that had already passed. And somewhere beyond the doorway a server called out an order, the sound distant but grounding, a reminder that the world outside this moment had not paused. "Choosing does not change the hours," Ava said finally, her voice calm, measured, and there was no resistance in it. Only clarity, the kind that came from living inside the limits she was describing, and Ethan did not interrupt, his eyes fixed on hers as if each word mattered more than the last, not because they challenged him, but because they revealed something he had not considered before. He leaned forward slightly, his hands resting flat against the table, the posture more focused now, less about offering and more about understanding. And when he spoke again, his tone carried a quiet certainty that had begun to form beneath the surface of the conversation. "Then the hours change," he said, simply. And the words did not come with emphasis. They did not need it. They landed as a solution rather than a suggestion, and Ava's expression shifted just slightly, not in surprise, but in recognition of the direction he was taking. You are talking about restructuring something you have not even built yet, she replied, her voice steady, and there was a subtle note beneath it, not doubt, but realism, and Ethan nodded once, acknowledging the point without stepping back from it. Everything starts that way, he said, his gaze unwavering, and the simplicity of the response carried weight, not because it solved the problem immediately, but because it reframed it into something possible. Ava's fingers moved lightly against the edge of the chair, a small grounding motion, and she glanced down for a brief second before looking back at him, her eyes thoughtful now, not closed off, but considering, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was active, like a space where something was being measured internally rather than spoken aloud. My mother cannot be moved, she said after a moment, her tone even, and the statement was not a barrier, but a fact, one that could not be negotiated or reshaped easily. And Ethan absorbed it without hesitation, his expression tightening slightly in thought, before settling again. Then nothing moves her, he replied. We work around that. And the phrasing was deliberate, not suggesting change where it could not happen, but adjusting everything else instead, and Ava held his gaze, the weight of that response settling differently than the ones before, because it did not push against her reality, it aligned with it. The room felt quieter now, not because the noise had disappeared, but because their focus had narrowed so completely that everything else seemed distant, and Ethan leaned back slightly, exhaling slowly as if the shape of his decision had finally taken form. You said you keep going, he added, his voice softer now. I am saying you do not have to do it alone. And the words did not carry pressure, they did not demand agreement. They simply existed, steady and open, and Ava did not answer immediately, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged. But there was a shift beneath the surface, subtle, almost imperceptible, like something beginning to move after being still for too long, and the moment held there, balanced, not resolved, but no longer the same as it had been before. The silence did not break all at once, it softened, settling into something quieter, something that no longer needed to prove itself, and Ava sat there for a moment longer, her gaze steady on Ethan, not resisting what he had offered, but not rushing toward it either, as if she understood that some decisions were not made in a single breath. The faint glow of the overhead lights reflected off the polished table, catching the edge of the glass. The small details of the room grounding the moment in something real, something that did not disappear when words ended, and she finally let out a slow breath, her shoulders easing just slightly, not in surrender, but in release. You are asking me to trust something that has not existed for me in a long time, she said, her voice calm, steady, and there was no accusation in it, only truth, the kind that did not need to be defended, and Ethan did not interrupt, did not argue, his expression still, attentive, as if he understood that this was not about convincing her, but about meeting her where she stood. He nodded once, slowly, his gaze steady. I am not asking for trust all at once, he replied, his voice quiet but certain. I am asking for a chance to earn it. And the words settled between them, not heavy, not forced, but grounded in something more deliberate than anything he had said before, and Ava held his gaze, searching not for the right answer, but for the truth behind it. The moment stretched, not uncomfortably, but with purpose, and somewhere beyond the room a door opened and closed, the soft sound echoing faintly, reminding them both that time had not stopped, even if this moment felt separate from everything else. Ava's fingers moved lightly against the edge of the chair, a small grounding motion, and she glanced down briefly before looking back at him, her eyes thoughtful, measured, as if she were placing each possibility carefully in front of her before choosing. One condition, she said finally, her voice even, and Ethan did not hesitate. Name it, he replied, his tone steady, ready, and Ava's gaze did not waver as she spoke. My mother comes first, always. And the words were simple, but they carried the full weight of everything that had shaped her choices, her limits, her strength, and Ethan nodded without pause, without negotiation. Then that is where we start. he said, and there was no hesitation in his voice, no attempt to reshape her condition into something easier, only acceptance, clear and immediate. The silence that followed was different now, not uncertain, not waiting, but settled, as if something had quietly aligned, and Ava leaned back slightly in her chair, not retreating, but allowing the moment to land fully, her posture still, composed, still grounded, but no longer holding the same guarded edge it had carried before. She stood then, slowly, the movement unhurried, her hand resting briefly on the back of the chair as she stepped away from the table, and Ethan rose as well, not out of formality, but because the moment called for it, and they stood there for a second, facing each other, the distance between them no longer defined by who had power, but by what had been understood. Ava gave a small nod, not dramatic, not symbolic, just real, and turned toward the doorway, the soft sound of her steps blending back into the rhythm of the restaurant. The world continuing around her as it always had, and Ethan remained where he was, watching her go, not with the detachment he had carried at the start of the night, but with something quieter, something more aware, and as the door closed softly behind her, the room felt different, not because anything had changed on the surface, but because something beneath it had shifted, something that could not be undone. And in that quiet, he understood, not all at once, but enough, that she had not just proven him wrong. She had shown him something he had not known he was missing. And for the first time that evening, he did not reach for the contract. He did not call his team back in. He simply stood there, in the stillness she left behind, letting that realization settle fully into place.